Imagine the sound. Not a scream of sudden pain, but something far worse. A low, guttural, endless moan that seems to seep from the very stones of the prison wall. It's the sound of a human being unraveling, not quickly, but over days, weeks, even months. This is not a dungeon in medieval Europe. This is a holding cell in Imperial China during the height of the Ming or Qing dynasty. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and something else. The cloying, sweet scent of opium, not given for mercy, but to keep a victim conscious just a little while longer. We have all heard stories of ancient torture, of dark ages and cruel punishments. But the system of judicial punishment developed in China over thousands of years was something else entirely. It wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was a dark art, a sophisticated, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly logical system designed to do more than punish the body. It was designed to annihilate the soul, to erase a person's past and future, and to send a message so stark and so horrifying that it would burn itself into the mind of every single citizen, ensuring absolute obedience. This is a journey into the heart of that darkness. This is not for the faint of heart. This is the story of the horrifying torture methods of Imperial China. To understand the horror, you must first forget everything you think you know about justice and fairness. In ancient China, particularly under the philosophical framework of legalism that dominated the Qin dynasty and never truly left, the law had one primary purpose: control. The state's authority was absolute, and social order was the highest virtue. To maintain it, the punishments couldn't just be severe. They had to be so creatively, symbolically brutal that the very idea of breaking the law would become unthinkable. The foundational legal principle was yi xingku xing, yi xingku qing, using punishment to eliminate punishment. The idea was that if the consequences were terrifying enough, no one would ever commit a crime, and punishment would eventually become unnecessary. It was a beautiful, utopian idea built on a foundation of pure, calculated terror. And at the core of this system was a requirement that made every trial a potential prelude to agony: the confession. A judge could not pass a sentence without a confession. This single rule turned the legal process into a factory for pain. The purpose of torture wasn't just to punish. It was to extract that vital admission of guilt, to make the accused participate in their own destruction. This is where our journey begins, not with the grand executions, but with the everyday bureaucratic machinery of pain that awaited anyone who fell into the hands of the magistrate. For the common person, the first taste of this system was often deceptively simple. It was a piece of wood, but not just any wood. This was the mujia, or the cangue. Imagine a large, heavy wooden board, weighing anywhere from 20 to 100 pounds, with a hole cut out in the center. Your neck would be locked into this hole, and your hands were often secured through two smaller holes on either side. The weight was excruciating, making it impossible to stand comfortably or lie down to sleep without choking yourself. But the true genius of the cangue was its public nature. You wouldn't be hidden away in a dungeon. You would be placed in a busy market square or at the city gates. The punishment was exposure. You were a public spectacle, utterly helpless, dependent on the kindness of strangers for scraps of food and sips of water, often subjected to ridicule and abuse from passers-by. The cangue didn't just imprison your body, it destroyed your social self, your dignity, and your place in the community. You were no longer a person, you were a warning. And this was one of the mildest punishments. It was a slow, grinding torture of shame and exhaustion, designed for petty crimes, but capable of breaking a person's spirit completely. But if your crime was more serious, or if the magistrate simply needed a confession, The simple cangue was replaced by something far more direct. This was zhangxing, the beating with the bamboo rod. Now, a beating sounds almost medieval, something common across many cultures. But in China, it was elevated to a precise bureaucratic science. The law codes, in their terrifying detail, would prescribe the exact number of strokes for specific crimes. But here lay the hidden horror. The phrase heavy beating was often a legal eupsychism for a death sentence. The outcome didn't depend on the number. It depended on the executioner's orders and the thickness of the prisoner's purse. A wealthy family could bribe the guards to use a light, hollow bamboo rod and strike the fleshy parts of the buttocks, causing pain but little lasting damage. A poor wretch with no money would be met with a solid, heavy rod, soaked in water to make it heavier, and the blows would be aimed at the kidneys or the base of the spine. A heavy beating could mean being literally pounded to death, your internal organs reduced to pulp, or your spine shattered, leaving you paralyzed if you somehow survived. This was corruption and cruelty intertwined, a system where the law was absolute, but its application was a marketplace of suffering. The bamboo rod was the most common tool of terror, the grinding, everyday engine of the state's power. And it set the stage for the true horrors that awaited those convicted of greater crimes. For those who confessed or were convicted of more serious offenses, the punishments became permanent marks of shame, designed to follow you for the rest of your life. These were the cutting punishments, the ruxing. There was moxing, the tattooing of your crime onto your face or forehead. The character for thief or bandit would be needled into your skin and then filled with ink, a permanent, inescapable brand that told the world who you were and ensured you could never escape your past. There was yixing, the amputation of the nose. Imagine the social and practical exile of such a mutilation. You were made a monster, visually and olfactorily repulsive, shunned by all. And perhaps most crippling of all was yuexing, the amputation of one or both feet at the ankle. This punishment, famously used in the Qin dynasty, was a death sentence for your old life. You could no longer work in the fields, you could barely walk, and you were condemned to a life of begging and dependency, a living, breathing monument to the cost of defying the law. These punishments were so effective because they weren't just physical, they were social and spiritual. In a culture that placed immense value on wholeness, ancestry, and social harmony, to be marked and mutilated was to be severed from the human community itself. You became a ghost, forced to haunt the edges of society as a constant reminder to others. But all of this was merely a prelude, the opening act of suffering before the main performance for those guilty of the most heinous crimes in the Chinese legal mind: high treason or the ultimate sin, killing one's parents. For these crimes, the punishment had to be more than death. It had to be a complete and total annihilation. It had to be Lingchi, the slow process, death by 1,000 cuts. The name itself is a masterwork of bureaucratic euphemism, but the reality was the most horrifying execution method ever devised by mankind. It wasn't a wild, frenzied attack. It was a meticulous, slow, and ritualized disassembly of a human being. The condemned would be taken to a public square, tied naked to a wooden frame. A specialist executioner, a master of his gruesome craft, would step forward. He worked from a detailed chart, a map of the human body designed to maximize the number of cuts while keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. The goal was not to kill quickly, but to prolong the agony for hours, sometimes even days. The first cuts were often to the eyelids, preventing the victim from closing their eyes to the horror of their own body being taken apart, piece by piece. Then, the executioner would begin his work in earnest, slicing away flesh from the arms, legs, and chest. Opium was sometimes administered, not out of mercy, but as a stimulant to ensure the victim didn't pass out from the shock too early. The crowd would watch, a mixture of horror and morbid fascination, as the person was gradually reduced to a screaming skeleton. The final cut was a stab to the heart, a moment of release that was itself a form of mercy. Lingchi was more than an execution, it was a statement. By destroying the body so completely, the state was also attempting to destroy the soul, preventing the victim from becoming an ancestor and existing in the afterlife. It was the ultimate punishment for the ultimate crime, not just ending a life, but erasing a person's entire existence from the past, present, and future. It was the absolute, final expression of state power. There were other methods, each with its own symbolic cruelty. Yaozhan, Waozhan, waist cutting, where a victim was bisected by a heavy axe or sword. Because the major organs are in the upper body, they could remain conscious for agonizing minutes after the cut, watching their own lower half separated from them. It was a symbolic severing from one's roots and ancestors. Or Chelia, dismemberment by chariots, where 5 horses or oxen would be tied to a person's limbs and head and driven in different directions, tearing them apart. This was the punishment for the Qin dynasty legalist Shang Yang himself, a grim irony for the man who helped design this brutal system. His body was literally pulled apart by the very state machinery he helped to create. The horrifying genius of Imperial Chinese torture was its multifaceted nature. It wasn't just about the physical pain, as unimaginable as it was. It targeted every aspect of a human being. The cangue targeted your social standing and dignity. The cutting punishments targeted your place in the community and your future. The beatings targeted your body and your will. And Lingchi targeted your very soul and your eternal existence. It was a complete system of control designed by bureaucrats and philosophers and executed with cold, precise efficiency. It was the dark shadow cast by a magnificent civilization, a reminder that order and artistry, philosophy and brutality can sometimes be 2 sides of the same coin. These methods were finally abolished in the early 20th century, but their legacy is a chilling lesson in the extremes of power and the terrifying logic of absolute control. They show us that the human capacity for cruelty is not born of simple savagery, but can be refined, systematized, and justified by the state into something far more sinister and enduring. It is a history written not in ink, but in blood and suffering. And it demands to be remembered, not to revel in the horror, but to understand the depths we are capable of plumbing, and to ensure we never, ever go back.